So you may have heard this idea of praise the effort, not the result, or this idea of verb-based recognition, right? So you should reward the activities or the inputs, the efforts that led to the results. But in practice, in our everyday lives, I think we tend to hear kind of a mix or maybe even more of the things like, hey, you're so smart, or you're so talented, or you're so good, right? You can think of the examples of like a kid coming home, he just won his baseball tournament, he's got his big trophy, and mom or dad's like, you're such a good baseball player, you're such an athlete. Or young person comes home with a great report card and you say, oh, you're so smart. And this even continues on, I would say, into, you think of college, someone gives a presentation, you say, oh, you're such a good presenter, you're so smart, I could never do that. And the thing that all of these have in common is that we can think of as label-based recognition or rewards, in that they have to do with kind of attaching a label to your identity. I am a blank, or I am this way. And we tend to think these are probably a good thing to do, right? Because you say, oh, you're so smart, or you're so talented, and this person that we tend to care about, or maybe we just work with, but usually someone we care about, starts to think, oh, I am amazing, I am so smart, I am brilliant, I am talented, whatever. But the research is actually very clear that we should not give recognition or reward in this sort of way. And this is because that these identity-based rewards or recognition, or these kind of label-based ones that focus on results, tend to undermine long-term growth. And so what we should focus on instead is what we set out at the very beginning, which is focusing on effort. So in this video, I'll explain all of this and why this is, drawing on one study from the scientific literature, and also suggest a better way to support the people we want to support and the people that we care about in a way that is more conducive to long-term performance, development, and with performance and development, ultimately, right, your happiness and quality of life. So I'll start with a story on this. I was in high school, pretty studious, although I had some partying mixed in with that as well. But, my parents being very supportive, especially my dad, would be like, yo, you're so smart, you're brilliant. My friends would be like, Jackson, you're so smart. And this was all great. And to let you in on kind of the nerdy side of me, I did have like a 4.6 GPA or something because I took AP classes and did well on all my tests and everything. But then when I applied to every single Ivy League school, which I did, and didn't get into any of them, it kind of hit home in a pretty deep emotional way. And I just almost felt like outraged or like in disbelief of like, how is it that I can't get in here? It had such a like deep personal impact, and it made me for a time kind of question some of these things about me. Now, let's kind of connect this to some of the literature here. And I'm going to reference a paper primarily here that is titled Praise for Intelligence Can Undermine Children's Motivation and Performance. This is by Claudia Mueller and Carol Dweck. And in this paper, they did something kind of interesting. So they look at fifth graders, and they sort them into two groups that get two different kinds of praise or rewards. So one of them is performance-based, and the other is more effort-based. And then they start to look at, are there any differences in children who receive this type of recognition? Well, it turns out the first thing they looked at was what they cared about. And so what they found is the fifth graders who were more rewarded or recognized or received praise on the basis of their results and their performance tended to care more about performance-based goals than learning-based goals. So you can imagine what that means, is that they cared more about saying, oh, I got an A+ on my quiz, than they cared about actually learning how to do geometry, or I don't know, whatever fifth graders are studying at that point, multiplication. So you can start to see how maybe that wouldn't be the best thing. Now, continuing on, where it connects back to the personal story I shared, is that when they looked at how these children responded to failure or adversity, there was a pretty sharp contrast. And that the group that had received the performance-based recognition, as opposed to, again, the effort-based one, tended to be less resilient. So when they didn't do well on something, they had a harder time recovering and performing better in the future. And we think kind of the reasoning here is what I shared, is that when they had these labels attached to their results of like, I got a good grade, so I am so smart, when something comes up to challenge that, or there's a setback or some adversity, they're far more likely to say then, oh, maybe I'm not smart, or oh, I'm dumb, or I can't do this, right? So that kind of identity label there that is tied to the results and the performance as opposed to the effort can be detrimental and starts to undermine resiliency a little bit. And that relates closely to the final distinction they saw, which is that the children who were in the performance and results-based recognition tended to have a more fixed mindset view of their learning and development. So what that means is, and this draws upon the literature primarily from Carol Dweck, who is a pioneer, and she's one of the people who contributed to this study, but more broadly, she's developed this idea of growth mindset. And so growth versus a fixed mindset talks about how we fundamentally view how we engage with the world and our own traits and capacities. So a growth mindset tends to view skills and traits and all those sorts of things as things that can be developed and enhanced through intentional effort, whereas fixed mindset tends to be, oh, well, that's just who you are, right? Kind of like your height, because despite some people, maybe it's best efforts, you can't just try harder to be taller or shorter if you want to be shorter. So you can imagine again how that comes up in life, right? You have someone who maybe says, oh, I'm just not a good singer, I'm just not a good writer, I'm just not good at math. And that's sort of like the end of the conversation. Where someone with a growth mindset, maybe not, they don't think they're so amazing or something, but they say, oh, well, I know that if I practice speaking or practice writing or practice my mathematics, I can get better at it. So you start to see, you can imagine how that distinction would play out over the course of a lifetime when it comes to all sorts of personal development as well as the professional domain. So in this study, again, what we see is that these children, and I should maybe give a caveat here that most of the literature I'm drawing on in this study was in child development, but I think we can sort of draw this out and say similar implications most likely for adult and adolescent development. So what we see is that these children who are rewarded or recognized on the basis of effort, the ones that are rewarded for effort, tend to be more resilient to failure. They tend to value the learning more than just the getting the grade or getting the outcome, and they tend to have more of a growth mindset. All of those things contribute to their development and ultimately their quality of life in the future. So how do we do this then, right? Is there a better way to give recognition or to give feedback? And kind of stepping back from the literature a little bit here, I'll just draw on what we teach in our training consulting practice. We do a lot of work with leadership development, working with the U.S. Army command teams, or the Army National Guard command teams, as well as in the private sector. And often the distinction we make is praising versus witnessing. So your praising is your traditional pat on the back. Hey, good job. Here's what you did. You're super good. You rock. Now, witnessing, on the other hand, you can imagine receiving praise that's more like this, right? So in one case, the traditional way is maybe you hit your sales goal and your boss comes in and says, hey, good job on the sales, great month, you rock, keep it up. Now you can imagine a second case where your boss comes in and, hey, sit down for a second. So I just want to talk to you about what I observed over the last month. I saw you setting aside time to be really intentional about your process. I saw you kind of learning and trying new ways to get these different leads and set the appointments. And then my understanding, as we talked about it the one time, is that you went and shadowed 5 of our best reps and you learned how they approach their appointments and some of the tools that they use. You brought those into your appointments, right? So you were very intentional in your development and crafting your approach, and then you showed up consistently. I saw you putting in effort to show up at your best for clients and do research to be prepared before each call. You executed on the calls, right? You were focused, you were consistent, you were disciplined, and then you see what the results were. So you can imagine the second one, of course, I dressed it up a little bit, but that's like a much more profound feedback. And I think the reason is in the first one, the kind of pat on the back, good job, the validation is coming from two things that are both external. So they're coming from the result you got and me as the person giving the praise or the recognition, kind of validating you to say, you are good, you did it. In the witnessing example, notice that I didn't even say good job. I didn't even say you rock or you're amazing. All I did was say what I observed and said, and then you got the result. And so in that case, the sort of locus of control or the source of the validation is not so much me saying it and not even necessarily the result as much as the person who did the thing, their actions and their behaviors are the source of the validation, right? As again, opposed to this kind of external validation. So I think that's why this is a better way to kind of cultivate that growth mindset and that intrinsic motivation is focusing on the witnessing piece. And that's not to say you can't throw in a good job or tell the person you like, hey, you're a freaking rock star, you're amazing. But at least in this case, trying to do the witnessing, which is to appreciate and simply recognize, not even necessarily passing judgment on it. Just saying, hey, I've seen all that went into this. I see the effort. And then, of course, the result took care of itself. So to summarize this, right, we could be thinking about our kids, maybe we're thinking about our significant others, maybe we're just thinking about our friends or our colleagues. It's not that it absolutely can't at all be identity or label based, right? I'm going to take a little bit of liberty here from the literature and say, I think some of that is probably fine to say, hey, you're amazing, you rock, etc. But certainly we do not want to forsake the effort-based praise and recognition, and we don't want to focus too much on the identity and label and results-based recognition. Because when we focus on the efforts, the things they can control and the behaviors that went into the result, ultimately we're going to help them value their learning more. We're going to help them to be more resilient, because instead of when there's maybe a setback, instead of saying, oh, now I'm no longer smart, or I didn't get the results, so I must not be intelligent, or I must not be talented, or I can't do this. Instead, they have more of this, right, this learning and this growth mindset that says, I can continue putting in the work to develop, right? And that, of course, leads them to having this growth mindset, which has all sorts of positive implications for people as they go through life at any age. So I hope you enjoyed this video on how to give feedback and rewards and recognition in a way that is most beneficial to supporting other people with respect to their development, their performance, and ultimately their quality of life. So YouTube's going to suggest that you check out this video next, but for more practical tools on happiness in everyday life, you can check out my channel, some of the resources down below, such as my external brain, which is kind of a happiness Wikipedia, as well as studyhappiness.blog and happinessmeansbusiness.com, both of which are places that I share resources quite regularly. So again, thank you for watching. This has been your happiness nerd, Jackson Kirchis, and I'll see you next time.